So today's thought experiment about Abenthy potentially moving backwards through time in the name of the wind started from one specific passage that bothered me a bit the last time I read the name of the wind. And so here in chapter 10, Alar and Several Stones, we have been about to teach Kavoth the cornerstone of sympathy, being the Alar, how to hold one's Alar. And so Ben holds up a chunk of dirty fieldstone and asks Kavoth, "What will happen if I let go of this rock?" Kavoth says, "It will probably fall." To which Abenthy retorts, "Probably. You sound like a sophist, boy. Hasn't it always fallen before?" And they continue on through the lesson. The word sophist bothers me. It feels like, I don't know, maybe Ari with something out of place in the underthing. It just feels a bit out of place. And it is the only place this word is mentioned in the book is by Abenthy at this point. The reason it feels out of place for me isn't just because the word sophist comes from ancient Greece, because a lot of these words have etymologies and origins in something like that, but it's the way that it's used in a bit of a pejorative or kind of negative term towards how Kavoth is engaging in the learning process here. And so the word sophist, like I said, comes from ancient Greece, and it used to denote somebody who was wise or even like a master in their craft. Then it became the term for traveling teachers and tutors. So again, people who were experts in traveling to teach and tutor and were paid for it. And it wasn't a negative term really until Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle began to criticize the sophists. And a little more context for that, ancient Greece, democracy was becoming more important, and with that, the ability to convince somebody through argument to be on your side of something, to vote for something your way, to elect the person you want, those things became much more important because of democracy. And so the art of argument and rhetoric and logic really changed things in a fundamental way. We have Socrates and the like, kind of more Plato and the like, kind of criticizing the sophists for not engaging genuinely in truth-seeking, and instead they're looking to win an argument and to teach those how to win arguments, as opposed to diving for more truth and understanding of the world. And so the meaning of it changed from being somebody wise and an expert in their craft or field to being someone who's a bit disingenuous when it comes to engaging in argument and truth-seeking. And I think that latter connotation is a bit more how Abenthy uses it here. And so the fact that Abenthy is referencing ancient Greece is where the second piece that made this theory come about comes in. And that is somebody else in literature who references ancient Greece in a weird, anachronistic, or kind of not of the time way. And that would be Merlin in The Once and Future King, written by T.H. White. And so Merlin is tutoring our future king, King Arthur, known as the Wart at that time. And as his tutor, he actually knows the future of what's in store for King Arthur. He is living backwards through time. So Merlin was born at the wrong end of time, and our people who were born at the right end of time and living forward, their future is Merlin's past. And then the past is going to be Merlin's future. So he has knowledge, they call it like a second sight, he has knowledge of the future. And with that, he will reference sometimes ancient Greece, which is technically in the past from medieval Britain and King Arthur, but the translation of the text from Greek into Latin and then preserved through the Byzantine Empire and published throughout the world in the future, that information wasn't available at the time that King Arthur was around and Merlin was tutoring him. And so he has this knowledge that he's not really supposed to have. He also knows about World War II and talks about inventions of the future sometimes, because of his different experience of time. And so those references he makes to ancient Greece, and then this little kind of reference to ancient Greece, made me think, what an interesting character comparison. We have Abenthy teaching and tutoring Kvothe, a future Kingkiller, and we have Merlin teaching and tutoring the Wart, a future, King of the Round Table or Knight of the Round Table. And so that relationship made me think, well, what if Abenthy was living backwards through time? What if Rothfuss dropped this word in as like one little clue to say, hey, think about this? And so I did. I stopped and I thought about it, and I read the book backwards in little chunks, the entire part with Abenthy. And so when I was reading the book, pretending, this is what I did. I said, okay, I am going to pretend that Abenthy is in fact like Merlin in T.H. White's The Once and Future King, living backwards through time. How would that look for him? Like, what would his experience be like? And by the end of reading it with that premise in mind, I was like, this is so cool. I need to share it. And so that's what I'm about to do now. Welcome to the tinfoil forest, where I am going to read backwards through Abenthy and Kvothe's early young Kvothe's interaction with him, pretending that Abenthy is moving backwards through time, and let's see what evidence might support it to be true. So I'm not going to call this a theory, I'm going to call it a thought experiment, because that's really more what it is. And it's a fun one. So for this thought experiment, I have kind of 8 beats, 8 little scenes we're going to look at as if Abenthy were moving backwards through time. The first one is going to be what Ben is leaving behind. So if he is leaving behind his life in Hollowfell to join Kvothe's troop, young Kvothe and his troop there at what would be the kind of going away or parting of ways party time and city, what if that is when Abenthy is first meeting them? What life is he leaving? He's leaving his life in Hollowfell, where he was, as we know, with a woman there, a widow who had, in her timeline, lost her husband 2 years earlier, so she was now a widow. She has a young son who needs tutoring, and then she also has a brewery that she is running that her husband used to run, and so that Ben is poised to take over. And so let's pretend he's moving backwards in time, and so Ben has been working for the past, we don't know, years, set amount of time, some amount of time that we don't know, as one, like a partner or husband to this widow, 2, as a tutor to the young son. Well, that's really helpful because teaching and tutoring are a difficult art to master, especially like a young boy teaching a young boy. So we have Abenthy, who's been doing that for a little while. That's great practice for his next upcoming role. And then he's been working as a brewer as well, so he's good at brewing ale. That's what he's leaving behind. Now, if we think about the reason that Ben is so perfectly aligned for the job that everyone else thinks he's about to get, everyone in the troop is like, we arrived in Hollowfell, and here's this like almost trap waiting for Ben. Well, that's the job he's been doing for the last few years in his timeline. Of course he's perfectly suited to it. They say, as you can see, I don't think anyone could have built a better snare for Ben if they had tried. I think it's because he was already doing that job, if we're reading it from forward to back. So that's what Ben is leaving behind. It also kind of makes sense when they talk about him walking around with the, I'm going to call her the widow's wife, because that's what she's referred to in the book here. However, anyone who saw the two of them walking together knew the truth behind that story. And so they're walking together in a very comfortable, familiar, or, infatuation, early love kind of way. Well, that's because, again, Abenthy might already know that they're a good match and that they've been together, and he's actually saying goodbye at this point. So he's getting ready to leave this woman he's been with, the son he's been tutoring, and the breweries he's been running. That's a bit sad. So Ben might feel, a going away, that mix of emotion of an excitement, but also a bit of melancholy for what he's leaving. Part 2. Getting to know the troop party. And so this part is really interesting. If we think about the goodbye party, not really as a goodbye party, but in some ways kind of a getting to know the troop party from Ben's perspective. So first, I think this is interesting. Ben opened a small keg of mead he had been saving for just such an occasion. I remember it tasting the way I felt, sweet and bitter and sullen. And so that's funny, because if Ben was saving this keg for such an occasion, this keg might not have been traveling around on his wagon for the past few seasons with the troop, and instead, this keg might have been right here in Hollowfell that he was saving for just such an occasion as he is moving backwards through time. And so at this going away party, Ben gets to see truly how impressive this performing troupe is, because Kvothe tells us that this party, which is his early 12th birthday party and Ben's going away party, have been combined, and that when you have a party that is specifically for troopers entertaining troopers, they go all out. So this is not a half-assed performance. They're really going for it here. And so Ben gets to hear things like the Lay of Sir Savian, played by Kvothe's parents, which we know is a cunningly complex song with melodies and counter-harmonies and men and women's voices coming together. And so that's one of the performances he hears. He also gets to hear a bit of Kvothe's father's song, the intro to the song about Lanre, and so wow, he gets that right away. And he gets this whole party situation going. One part of this party that always bothered me, and I'm going to read it now, is when Ben and Shandy go off together. And I remember this also bugging me a little the first time I read it. It just seemed weird. It didn't seem like it fit with Ben's personality. So at this going away party, Shandy offered to do a special dance for Ben, but only if he came into her tent to see it. I'd never seen Ben blush before, but he did it well. He hesitated, and when he refused, it was obviously about as easy for him as tearing out his own soul. Shandy protested and pouted prettily, saying she'd been practicing it for a long time. Finally, she dragged him into the tent, their disappearance encouraged by a cheer from the entire troop. So if Ben is leaving this troop, he's already in love with kind of another woman, and it's why it's part of his going away party. Would we really have one of the troop dancers convince him into a tent for a private dance? It just doesn't really seem like it fits with him. But this is a little conspiratorial, but if Shandy was actually someone who knew that this was Abenthy's welcome to the troop, maybe he's part of a larger network of people who are working to preserve something or educate someone about something. What if Shandy was kind of in on it, and the reason she's so insistent to pull Ben away privately into the tent is not to give him a debriefing, but to give him a debriefing, to tell him what is going on with this troop, what information he needs to know so that he doesn't all of a sudden feel completely out of place. Because I don't think that Abenthy is telling anyone in this troop besides Shandy, and maybe, I don't know, Trip is a little suspicious to me as well, that he is moving backwards through time. He acts as if he is living life just like everyone else. And so I think Shandy pulling him away may have been her giving him information about troop life coming in. Beyond that, what about him getting to know Kvothe, kind of meeting Kvothe for the first time? Let's read this interaction, this goodbye interaction between the two of them, as if it's kind of a Abenthy not saying goodbye, but getting to know him. I can't remember what I said to him before I left. I know it felt woefully inadequate, but I knew he understood. He made me a promise not to get myself into any trouble tinkering with the things he had taught me. He stooped a bit and gave me a hug, then tousled my hair. I didn't even mind. In semi-retaliation, I tried to smooth out his eyebrows, something I'd always wanted to try. His expression was marvelous in its surprise. He gathered me into another hug, then he stepped away. We never hear Abenthy tousling Kvothe's hair. That doesn't really reflect their relationship from what I've seen. That's more how you would treat like a less mature, maybe even younger version of Kvothe. Maybe you tousled the hair of the young boy you were just playing a paternal figure and tutoring when you were living in Hollowfell, so you're used to that interaction. But for that to be how you two interacted, I don't know, a little out of nowhere. And then Kvothe's reply of like smoothing out his eyebrows, he's so shocked because he's like, is that what my relationship with this kid is like? Oh wow, like we have a completely different relationship than the one I've just had. This is going to be interesting. And so that's their welcome. We also have here the inscription of rhetoric and logic, but I am going to leave that for another video because I have a 3-part series planned about that inscription. It's another one that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole, so subscribe for that. But that would be Abenthy getting to know the troupe at that party. So that's our second beat. The third beat was getting to know Kvothe, which I kind of just started with him tousling his hair. And so now let's go deeper into Abenthy getting to know Kvothe, as if he's kind of meeting young Kvothe for the first time here. And so the incident that happens just before this going away party, the kind of biggest story beat before it, is when Kvothe rather foolishly, and full of folly, binds the air in his lungs to the air outside when he is attempting to kind of call the wind. And he does this and almost kills himself. I'll get more into that incident. Abenthy saves him. And then after that, Kvothe's perception is that Abenthy is keeping himself at a bit of a distance because of that incident. So he's like, this went wrong, and so he's keeping me at a distance. But if he's just getting to know you, that might feel like being kept at a distance. And so that misinterpretation that Kvothe very regularly has for why people are acting the way they are is to me like a very essential part of this book. And this would be like a very clear demonstration of Kvothe being wrong, of him assuming somebody is acting a way for a reason that he makes sense to him, but is not made clear from the other person's end, and therefore is just not clear. It's also why I think Kvothe is actually a red-haired red herring, because he is constantly misattributing why people do things, and that throws us off. That's why he's really the unreliable narrator, is just because he's wrong so often. And so here we are after the incident, and Abenthy is talking, and he says, "It took a full span of days before Ben was his normal, jovial self again." Yeah, a few days after he just left his family that he had been with for him to become his normal, jovial self, that's a grieving process. That makes sense. But even then, things weren't the same between us. We were still fast friends, like, as in they just met. But there was something between us, and I could tell he was consciously holding himself apart. Lessons ground to a near standstill, he halted my fledgling study of alchemy, limiting me to chemistry instead, and refused to teach me any sigildry at all. And on top of everything else, he began to ration what little sympathy he thought safe for me. So this, to me, could be someone who's trying to figure out the things that you know slowly, by kind of finding out where you are in the learning process, and they know the foundations that you need before this. Before that, we also have Abenthy giving Kvothe a very important lesson. So in The Once and Future King, Merlin saves what he thinks are some of the most important things for Arthur to take with him into the future towards the end of their relationship. He gives him that like really important advice of like, this is what I need you to know. He even tries to warn him more than he's able to about the dark future that may lay ahead during their leaving each other. But again, this is when Merlin would technically be kind of meeting Arthur. And so Abenthy gives this really important advice soon before they are going to split. And so he's talking to him about being thoughtless. And I'm just going to read this one out. Oh man, such a good line. Ben took a deep breath and tried again. Suppose you have a thoughtless 6-year-old. What harm can he do? And Kvothe is like, not much. Suppose he's 20 and still thoughtless. How dangerous is he? Still not much, but more than before. What if you give him a sword? Realization started to dawn on me, and I closed my eyes. More, much more. I understand, Ben. Really, I do. Power's okay, and stupidity is usually harmless. Power and stupidity together are dangerous. I never said stupid, Ben corrected me. You're clever. We both know that. But you can be thoughtless. A clever, thoughtless person is one of the most terrifying things there is. Worse, I've been teaching you some dangerous things. He even goes on later on, talking about what happened. You could kill yourself doing something as simple as that. He gave a sickly grin. Or looking for the name of the wind. Which is kind of funny, because Kvothe does almost kill himself when he's off looking for the name of the wind in Mayor Alveron's court. When he leaves the university and they is said to go looking for the wind. Many times he almost kills himself here. So if Abenthy knows the future and has heard stories about young Kvothe, he's going to hear stories about times that he almost killed himself, and he's going to know that these things he's teaching him, that he's starting him on, are going to be things that could almost potentially kill him in the future. Like, the first one was when he brought a flame to life in the center of the twigs and tinder, Abenthy. So he just started a fire with sympathy, and he's like, you could kill yourself doing that. Kvothe almost does, more than once. And so this kind of going away message, this is like soon before they're going to part, is one of the first things that Abenthy is talking with Kvothe about, because it's so important and he needs him to know it before they split ways. And now we're going to get back to the air binding incident. There's a little bit more here when Ben talks about Kvothe's father's song that I think has some more evidence that he may be living backwards through time, that he may know more about the future. You know, the song that he just heard some of, because this is after he talks to Kvothe's parents about the song, but before he hears the intro. It's kind of in the middle there. I'm going to skip it for now. Instead, we're going to go back to when Kvothe very foolishly binds the air outside to the air in his lungs, and Abenthy has to kind of save him. Here we are for this. I drew in a deep breath and spoke the words to bind the air in my lungs to the air outside. I fixed the alar firmly in my mind, put my thumb and forefinger in front of my pursed lips, and blew between them. There was a light puff of wind at my back that tousled my hair and caused the tarpaulin covering the wagon to pull taut for a moment. And so this is fun for me. Kvothe, instead of calling the wind, he does something else. He pseudo-calls the wind with these sympathetic bindings of the air. So now we know that this is something you can do. I'm going to give the spoiler away here. I'm not going to save anything. I have a suspicion that Abenthy can't actually call the wind. That Abenthy learned from Kvothe doing this, that you can bind the air to something else to make it seem like you can call the wind. The way he describes how he speaks the words and this happens is actually exactly what he sees Abenthy do when in Kvothe's timeline they first meet, and in Abenthy's timeline right before they split. And so if Abenthy's going backwards through time, he could have actually learned this bit of showmanship from our young Kvothe and used it himself later to kind of convince Kvothe or get Kvothe excited about him being his tutor and someone who would travel and teach him with his troupe. And so the reason I think this is because of the conversation that Ben has with Kvothe's parents just a little bit before this. So, give me one moment here. Here it is. So, Abenthy is talking with Arleden and Lorien. And they're talking about the Chandrian and their signs and things like that. But Ben says, I'll also admit to the fact that certain arcanists occasionally use prepared candles or torches to impress gullible townsfolk. Ben said, clearing his throat self-consciously. My mother laughed. Remember who you're talking to, Ben. We'd never hold a little showmanship against a man. In fact, blue candles would be just the thing next time we play Dionica. If you happen to find a couple tucked away somewhere, that is. And so we know that Abenthy is kind of admitting here that he can use prepared things, like candles or torches, to impress or, lie to gullible townsfolk. He does use red sympathy torchlight when Abenthy and Kvothe first meet, when Abenthy is trying to scare away the constable and mayor who are giving him trouble in the small town that they've both found themselves in. And so I wonder if it's not just the torches that were showmanship, but him calling the wind was actually a reference to this point. Now here's where Ben kind of fixes, or as we are made to think, kind of speaks the name of the wind to save Kvothe. But what if he's just undoing the sympathetic binding that Kvothe did? Because as we know, when it comes to the fishery fire, when Kilvin is asking Kvothe how he broke the drench to cover himself in water before going to save Fila, he says, well, I know the sigil tree for twice tough glass. What I can make, I can break. And so what if Ben knows the sympathetic bindings for air, and what he can make, he can break? Ben kneeled above me, but the sky was getting dim behind me. He seemed almost distracted, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he looked at me. All I remember were his eyes. They seemed far away and filled with a terrible power, dispassionate and cold. He looked at me. His mouth moved. He called the wind. A leaf in lightning, I shook, and the thunderclap was black. That's it. We don't know he called the wind there. That's what Kvothe sees. That's his perception. All we really know is that his mouth moved. And so that makes me a bit suspicious. So that's the air binding incident that we have. That's our fourth beat here. Now, before that, we have Abenthy speaking with Lorien and Arleden. I already talked about part of that conversation, which is when he talks about a little bit of showmanship. I'll also mention that they talk about Dionica there, implying that their troupe does perform that play, which is not apparently a very common play to have performed. And so it's interesting that Abenthy is quoting that play again way back in the beginning when Kvothe first sees him on his timeline, and he's impressed because he knows that play. I don't know if you'd be impressed if you thought he just spent a few seasons traveling with your troupe and therefore hearing them perform that play and having those words kind of ready at the start. But what else goes on in that conversation with Lorien and Arleden? Abenthy also says this to the two. I've had older students that would have loved to do half as well, he grinned. If I had his hands and 1/4 his wit, I'd be eating off silver plates inside of a year. And so this, I've had older students, yes, he just had an older student that he was tutoring in Hallowfell. It was the widow's son that he stepped into as a family member. And so this fact that he's like, I've had older students, I think is a little bit telling that he may have just had an older student that obviously may have been, intelligent or a well-mannered boy or something, but he's noticing the difference between that student and Kvothe. Kvothe's kind of insatiable lust for learning and his ability to teach Kvothe and have him learn so quickly. And so that's the beat that's happening just before this conversation that he has with his parents, is Abenthy teaching and tutoring the young Kvothe. And some interesting quotes from that. First we have in chapter 11, The Binding of Iron. I sat in the back of Abenthy's wagon. It was a wonderful place for me, home to 100 bottles and bundles saturated with 1,000 smells. To my young mind, it was usually more fun than a tinker's cart. But not today. It had rained heavily the night before, and the road was thick with a morass of mud. Since the troop was not in any particular schedule, we had decided to wait a day or two to give the roads time to dry. And so this is just kind of funny because in the Once and Future King, when Merlin is tutoring a young wart, he specifically comes in on like a rainy day because he's upset that he can't go and do his regular boyhood things because the people who look after him, the women who look after young Wart, won't let the boys go out on a rainy day. And so he's like bored and annoyed, and he goes to get a lesson from Merlin. And Merlin's like, lessons aren't just for when you're bored. And he's like, and then he's like, okay, but learning is like the most important way to deal with boredom. Let me teach you a cool lesson. And so this kind of rainy day vibe, very subtle here. I'm not saying this is a clue, but I see a parallel. And if our author Rothfuss is trying to parallel, this would be a nice way to do it. A nice little nod to the education environment of a young wart and his wizard tutor, Merlin. Also, the little Tinker's Cart reference, I'm going to bring that up again in the beginning/end of this theory. We also have the tutoring that Ben was doing. And so this is more nail on the head than I would have thought that Rothfuss would have done if this theory is in fact true, if Abenthy is potentially moving backwards through time. So he's teaching him all these things, and he says to him, here we go. He's talking about all the things he's learned, how he's learned the formula for 12 poisons and acids and 100 medicines and cure-alls, some of which even worked. I doubled my herb lore in theory, if not practice. Abenthy started to call me Red, and I called him Ben, first in retaliation, then in friendship. Only now, far after the fact, do I recognize how carefully Ben prepared me for what was to come at the university. He did it subtly, once or twice a day, mixed in with my normal lectures. Ben would present me with a little mental exercise I would have to master before we went on to anything else. And so he talks about mastering the skills. Let me just read it out. It's a great passage. He made me play Tyranny without a board, keeping track of the stones in my head. Other times he would stop in the middle of a conversation and make me repeat everything said in the last few minutes, word for word. This is another really great reference that I just realized to the Once and Future King. In that book, we have Robin Hood out in the woods, and he has his merry men. They're going on like an adventure mission to get something back from Morgan. And so we have Robin Wood out in the woods. And what he does is he says the directions word for word to his men, and then they repeat it word for word to each other until everyone has everything word for word, and then they go off on their mission. And so training Kvothe to do that, again, I see another little nod over to the Once and Future King, potentially. I'm sure these aren't the only 2 books that happens in. It's a great tactic. But I see a little nod potentially there. And the way he says that Ben was preparing him for what was to come at the university. I think Ben is preparing you not just for the university, yes, but for what he knew the skills you would need in the future. Not just for the university, but he is, in fact, preparing you for the future because that's where he's from. Again, not a theory, a thought experiment, but it is a fun one, right? Thinking about this is potentially true. And so there's just a lot of learning and education that goes on in this beginning part. Abenthy teaching Kvothe so much fairly quickly to prepare him. And again, it makes sense if he was literally just tutoring another boy right before this, kind of mastering his skills as a teacher. This line's also a good one. They're talking about Abenthy. Chemistry was his particular love, and my father said he'd never known a man to run a better still. And again, I laugh, because it's like, yeah, that's what his job before this was. He was running a really good still, because that's right in the beginning of chapter 9 when they're first introducing Abenthy riding with the troop. Now before that, before Abenthy comes along with the troop, is the meeting of Abenthy and the troop and young Kvothe. And it is also potentially the goodbye. It is Abenthy leaving the troop on his timeline. And so I've talked a lot about this one already because I mentioned my theory that to become a member of the troop, Abenthy is purposefully putting on a little show in front of Kvothe because that's a great in. He's a well-respected member of the troop. He's, excited. And so I do think that he may in fact put on a little bit of a show over Trip's shoulder. That's part of the reason that I'm a little suspicious of Trip as well, is the way he's kind of positioned himself, being a jester as people are coming into the show. And so Kvothe is watching Trip, and over Trip's shoulder is where he sees Abenthy interacting with this small town mayor and constable. And him watching his interaction with them is what gets him kind of intrigued by Abenthy and excited to go and talk with him. And then the conversation that they have is so parallel to, again, Abenthy leaving the job that is for a job that is going to be perfect for him. Here he's arriving with a troop, and it's like, oh, he's actually a perfect person to travel with the troop. He knows exactly what to offer to have it be of course you're going to come with us if you'd like to. Again, because he'd just been doing that job. It's like having a resume and applying for your own job that you were just doing. You should be the best fit for it because you've just been doing it. And so let's read a few of those examples now. Here we are. Kvothe is looking over Trip's shoulder and he hears Abenthy arguing with the mayor. Told you, I don't have a license. I don't need a license. Does a peddler need a license? Does a tinker need a license? You're not a tinker, the mayor said. Don't try to pass yourself off as one. I'm not trying to pass myself off as anything, the old man snapped. I'm a tinker and a peddler, and I'm more than both. I'm an arcanist. You great dithering heap of idiot. That is interesting to me. Time for my next walk in the tinfoil forest. Welcome, welcome. If Abenthy is moving backwards through time, potentially, could he also potentially be a tinker? He says here that he is a peddler, he is a tinker, and he's more than that. He's an arcanist. He doesn't deny being a tinker, even though the mayor kind of puts him like, you're not a tinker. He does say he is. What if the reason that some tinkers seem to know exactly what you are going to need is because tinkers are all moving, or some moving, backwards in time. There are some tinkers that experience the world backwards. They are moving from the future to the past, and if they know the future, then they may have heard the stories of what is just happened in this area, and they might know what a person would need for what is about to happen in this area. That could explain why the tinker twice, two different tinkers, have met Kvothe right before he's about to be on a adventure where he's going to need things outside his day-to-day objects and items. And the tinkers suggest exactly what he's going to need, and he doesn't take it twice. Oh, Kvothe. So there's the extra little cherry on top. Are tinkers, potentially not just Abenthy, moving backwards through time in this universe, in this world? And so we have Abenthy, a deep red light welled up from the four corners of his wagon. "That's far enough," he said ominously, "or things could get ugly otherwise." After a moment's surprise, I realized the strange light came from a pair of sympathy lamps the old man had mounted on his wagon. I had seen one before in Lord Greyfallow's library. They were brighter than gaslight, steadier than candles or lamps, and lasted nearly forever. Now, it's funny because Kvothe talks about seeing this as nothing more than like a show. He's like, oh, I could see that he has these lamps prepared. While he can see that Abenthy is not above showmanship and having prepared lamps, he does not apparently see that Abby might not be above showmanship of fake calling the wind. And this is how it happens. From where I hid, I saw the Arcanist's face change from anxious to pained to angry, all in a second. I saw his mouth move. A furious gust of wind came out of nowhere, as if a storm had suddenly burst with no warning. The wind struck the old man's wagon, and it tipped onto 2 wheels before slamming back down onto 4. The wind faded as quickly as it had come. And then he says, I finally realized why his words seemed so familiar. He was quoting lines from the exorcism scene in Daonica. Not many folk knew that play. And so that is what impresses Kvothe so much. All we know is he saw his mouth move, and then he saw the wind to do something. He saw Abenthy affect the wind. He did not necessarily see him call it. This may have been a sympathetic binding that Abenthy has prepared to make a gust of wind when needed. Why do we think that could happen? Because we've seen that in his past when he saw Kvothe bind the air and make a gust of wind happen. And he thought, oh wow, I could actually do that, but I'm not going to bind it to the air in my lungs. I'm going to bind it to something else to make this gust and improve on the foolish magic that Kvothe tried, or the magic that Kvothe tried to use in a foolish way. And so that is, to me, very interesting. I'm kind of convinced that Abenthy might not be able to call the wind. And so Kvothe approaches him after this and they have a little conversation. And the first thing he brings up is that he's misspelled the word ailments on his little sign out there. Because we have Abenthy, Arcanist Extraordinary, Scribe, Dowser, Chemist, Dentist, Rare Goods, all ailments tended. Lost items found, anything mended. No horoscopes, no love potions, no malefaction. It kind of reads a little like a tinker's rhyme that they would call out coming into town, so it does have a tinker feel to it. And he says to them, "You've misspelled ailments," I pointed out. He looked surprised. "It's a joke, actually," he explained. "I brew a bit." "Oh, ale," I said, nodding. "I get it." And so that's kind of funny, because it's like, I brew a bit. He literally used to be a brewer at his job before this, when he was in Hollowfell, running a brewery for the widow's wife. And then he says, "I've heard of you," when Kvothe introduces who his troupe is. "Good troupe, good reputation." Yeah, he would know that. He's been traveling with them. "Do you think your father might be interested in taking on any help? I don't claim to be much of an actor, but I'm handy to have around. I can make you face paint and rouge that aren't all full of lead and mercury and arsenic. I can do lights too, quick, clean, and bright. Different colors if you want them." He's applying exactly for the job that he knows would benefit this troupe. How does he know it? Because he's been traveling with this troupe for a while. This is what is going to get him in with the adults. They're like, yeah, this is very practical. And then before that, his performance is what gets him in with Kvothe, what makes him come over to talk to him. Very end of this chapter here, very last of my tinfoil forest fun here. But underneath it all, I was moved by my curiosity. I had seen Abenthy do something I could not explain, something strange and wonderful. Not his trick with the sympathy lamps. I recognized that for what it was. Showmanship, a bluff to impress ignorant townsfolk. What he had done afterward was different. He called the wind, and the wind came. It was magic. Real magic. the sort of magic I'd heard about in stories of Taborlin the Great. And then he talks about introducing him to the troupe, and he says, though I didn't know it at the time, I was looking for the name of the wind. And again, I think he recognizes the light trick for what it was, but he doesn't have enough knowledge to recognize the sympathetic binding of air for what it was, and so he assumes that Abenthy called the wind, even though maybe he cannot. But his assumption of that, his wanting to learn that, really drives him to want to make sure that Abenthy joins his troupe, and then makes him a great student because there's this carrot way out there dangling of something that he might learn, the magic that he really wants to learn in the future out there. And so as Ben is teaching him, he's already curious, he was going to learn a lot, but he takes this learning and the kind of respect he has for his teacher in a slightly different way after that greeting. And again, if Abenthy had already known Kvothe, he would know what type of action would get him most excited to learn and be Abenthy's student. And so that is my theory. My thought experiment. I wouldn't even call it a theory. I would call it a thought experiment. That Abenthy could be potentially moving backward in time. If nothing else, it was written in a way that if you read it in these chunks going backward, it can make you pause and go, well, that kind of fits. And it does kind of fit with the fact that Kvothe is just constantly wrong about the reasons people are doing things. And so that's a whole nother video that I have an interest in making, is like all the times Kvothe assumes or ascribes motivations to people when you have to go, wait, what? You're very convinced that that's true? Why are you convinced that that's true, Kvothe? Why are you convinced that that's why they are doing this? I have a few videos lined up. Since if you've made it this far, you get to vote. Here are some of the next things that I am excited to work on. I would be more than happy to work on. If there's one that you're excited about, let me know in the comments. First is the 3-part series on the inscription Ben leaves in Rhetoric and Logic. And I'll be honest, the 3-part series all really centers on be wary of folly. That word folly is so interesting to me. I start my 3-part series. I'm planning to start it on kind of the etymology of folly so we can really understand that warning better. And then we're going to go into some of the personifications of folly in different myth and folklore. And so if you're interested in those, then let me know you want the folly series, and cool. That's one of the ones I wanted to work on. I also really want to work on the Lay of Cersavian. I have a whole video on the story of Cersavian and kind of a retelling of what might be kind of the real world story of Savignon. And so if you're interested in that, if you're interested in the Cersavian video, I'm like super excited for that one. There's going to be a little bit more storytelling in that. So if you don't mind like a story within your story, if you don't mind that, I know I don't mind that. That's a good video because I'll have some stories within the story there. And then the other ones I'm interested a little bit on here as we talk about the introduction of Alar and sympathy and kind of its relationship with classic Greek philosophy and the philosophy that's come out of there. Rene Darquet. Cartesian Wax is what I was really thinking, which one would make a great name of a band, Cartesian Wax. But two is Rene Descartes has some really interesting philosophy that overlaps interestingly with the kind of Alar and sympathetic magic rules. So I think that's interesting. I'd be happy to do a video that kind of compares some of the real world philosophy and philosophers to their influence on that magic. I also kind of want to do the history of sympathy. So we'd be talking about references to like the 5 magics, books that predate the Name of the Wind that include sympathetic magic, even how it converts back to ancient Egypt. We talk about representational magic and kind of how you would make a representation of something. Maybe before you're going out to hunt, you would do like a simulated hunt and you would practice your victory through the art before going out to do it. So that was like kind of the earliest sympathetic magic, is a piece of something representing the whole. So a piece of animal representing the whole in a hunt. Those are kind of some of the ones I'm interested in. So we have history of sympathy, that would be really fun. We have, I guess that would go hand in hand with the modern philosophy like Rene Descartes and Cartesian. I say Cartesian wax because he also talks about wax, and we have wax being a really big part of a sympathist tools. So we've got that one. We've got the sympathy video, the Folly series that I'm super excited about doing, 3-part series, and then we have the Lay of Sir Savian. There's 3, kind of a breakdown of that one. So if you are interested in any of those topics, please go ahead and let me know in the comments, and I would be happy to have you help direct the direction of this channel. Also, just a really big thanks. At the time of filming this video, I have 12 subscribers, and so all 12 of you, huge thanks. I genuinely appreciate it. And I had someone today leave a comment on my summary video saying they enjoyed how detailed of summary it was because they're about to read The Wise Man's Fear, and so I'm assuming listening to that video beforehand kind of gave a good refresher, and they took the time to stop and to leave that comment. And as a very small channel, that really genuinely means a lot and put me in a great mood for filming today because I'm getting back into this after taking a little bit of a break from filming. So thank you to the commenters and to the subscribers and to any future subscribers I get from this video and future commenters I get. It really does mean a lot on a small channel when you stop and engage. So thank you very much. Don't forget to let me know what video you would like to have next because I'm excited to work on all of those, and I will see you in the next one.